Before it arrived in Brazil, the origins of Jiu-Jitsu are believed to go back at least 4,000 years, when the art was practiced by Buddhist monks in the Indian subcontinent. From there, the gentle art of Jiu-Jitsu traveled all the way to Japan before eventually ending up in South America, where it was transformed into a new and unique style by a group of local pioneers known as the Gracies. If you practice any form of martial arts or even simply follow one as a fan, you must have heard the word Gracie a gazillion times. But do you know how this exceptionally talented family that eats, sleeps, and breathes the art of limb twisting transformed it into a global phenomenon? If not, then you must watch this video till the end. When the days of the samurai came to a close, Japanese warriors turned towards new sportive ways to keep their fighting spirit alive by practicing variations of Jiu-Jitsu, such as Aikido and especially Judo, a style that was developed by Jiu-Jitsu legend Jigoro Kano in the late 19th century. It was in fact Kano's variation of Jiu-Jitsu that traveled all the way to South America thanks to one of his students, Mitsuya Maeda, who introduced his style in Brazil. In the early 20th century, Maeda was handed the opportunity to travel to Brazil as part of a Japanese immigration colony. He settled in the northern part of Pará with the help of an influential businessman named Gastão Gracie. Since Maeda didn't have enough money to buy his businessman friend a gift that'd match his stature, he offered to teach traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu to Gastão's oldest son, Carlos Gracie, as a goodwill gesture. A century later, Maeda's gift is one that keeps on giving. Carlos was a smart learner and grasped the fundamentals quickly, before passing them down to his brothers. Interestingly, one of his brothers, Helio Gracie, another influential figure in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history, couldn't roll on the mats since he was a sickly child, and would faint every time he had to do a strenuous task. Nobody knew why, and until his teenage years, Helio was limited to watching his brothers train because doctors wouldn't allow him to join them for obvious reasons. At the age of 14, Helio moved in with his older brothers, including Carlos, who taught Jiu-Jitsu in a house in Botafogo, but he still couldn't train. Watching his brothers was enough for him to learn the art, however, and his family discovered his legendary talents when he taught a group of students in the absence of Carlos, despite the fact he had never really had a good training session in his life. When Carlos showed up and apologized for his delay, he was surprised to know that his students had a great time with his younger brother, and they wanted to continue training with him. Carlos agreed and let Helio work as an instructor in his gym, and the rest is history. Prior to that, Jiu-Jitsu was more traditional. The techniques used therein were tough on the body and were no longer suitable in modern combat. Being a frail kid, Helio couldn't execute those techniques easily, so he decided to modify the style to accommodate physically weaker fighters. Helio based his style of Jiu-Jitsu on the principles of leverage and timing instead of strength and speed, and after years of trial and error, he managed to create the Gracie or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which today is one of the most popular martial arts in the world. Creating the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was one thing, making people believe in it was another. And Helio had to do it by taking part in tournaments and taking on far bigger adversaries. To prove the effectiveness of his new system, Helio openly challenged reputable martial artists in Brazil to come and have a go at him. Two of his more notable fights came against heavyweight wrestling champion Władysław Zbyszko and Japanese judo sensation Kato, who was the number 2 ranked judoka in the world at that time. His most notable battle was against the greatest jiu-jitsu fighter in the history of Japan, Masahiko Kimura. Helio managed to beat Kato, but he lost to Zbyszko and Kimura, although he received a lot of praise from his opponents. Kimura in particular urged Helio to travel to Japan and teach his techniques there, since they did not exist in the land of the rising sun. As years passed, Helio refined his technique and produced a number of world-class Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighters, and his knowledge was passed down to generations who continued to rule the world for years until competition got tougher with the popularization of the sport. While Helio created the gentle art, the second generation of Gracies added its own flair to it and took the sport to another level. Rickson Gracie, Helio's most talented son in particular, was a world beater. During the 70s, he was regarded as the best fighter in Brazil. Like his father and uncle Carlos Gracie, Rickson too set down the Gracie challenge by inviting fighters to come and beat him at his gym. Rickson rose to prominence at a young age, earning his black belt at only 18 years old and winning tons of competitions by the age of 20. His most notable victory came against Vale Tudo legend Casimiro Martins, a renowned brawler in Brazil. Throughout the 70s and 80s, BJJ remained one of the few popular martial arts in Brazil, with Luta Livre being a strong rival. Both the BJJ and Luta Livre camps tried to take the top spot in the country, with the level of animosity between the two camps lasting generations. To counter the Luta Livre thread, Helio's son Royce Gracie decided to internationalize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and there wasn't a better way of doing that than taking the sport to the United States. After moving to California, Royce taught BJJ for years, and by the early 90s, he had grown a huge following. One of his students was an advertising executive named Art Davey, who was so fascinated by Royce's stories of the Gracie Challenge that he decided to do something similar in the United States. Together, the teacher-student duo decided to start a competition known as the War of the Worlds, which they took to the pay-per-view TV company Semaphore Entertainment Group. The name of the competition was changed to the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or the UFC, which today is the biggest mixed martial arts promotion in the world. The UFC was both put together and popularized by Gracie. While Royce co-founded the promotion, Royce Gracie introduced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the no-holds-barred style of combat to the rest of the world. For many, Royce is both the most influential Gracie and the most influential MMA fighter of all time. If it wasn't for Royce, the UFC probably wouldn't be where it is today. Royce entered the UFC 1 tournament as the representative of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. The 16-man tournament mainly consisted of kickboxers, most of whom had never experienced submission grappling before. Gracie won thrice in one night, beating Art Jimerson by submission in under 3 minutes in the semifinals, beating Ken Shamrock by submission in under 1 minute in the quarterfinals, and winning the tournament by defeating Gerard Gordeau in less than 2 minutes. Royce was way smaller than his adversaries, but his style was simply larger than life at that moment in time. His foes were like a fish out of water. Royce's win propelled Gracie Jiu-Jitsu to unimaginable heights of fame, with people signing up at Gracie gyms in Brazil and abroad in huge numbers to learn a martial art that seemed to be invincible. Royce Gracie's dominant run in human cockfighting, or mixed martial arts, continued for more than 6 years. He entered the UFC 2 tournament and absolutely smashed each of his 4 opponents as well, winning all of his fights in the first round. Once again, martial arts enthusiasts were left with their eyes wide open after witnessing a style so fluid and unassuming, yet so devastatingly effective. Suddenly, it didn't matter who hit harder or who had the better wrestling or striking. Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was the talk of the town. Gracie kept on winning in the UFC, winning the UFC 3 quarterfinals, but he withdrew due to fatigue. Nevertheless, he'd come back and win the UFC 4 tournament by submitting mixed martial arts legend Dan Severn after 15 minutes of action. Severn was Gracie's most resilient test up until that point, yet he failed to do the unthinkable. Gracie then faced Ken Shamrock in a rematch for the UFC Super Fight Championship. The fight went on for 36 minutes before it was declared a draw due to a lack of judges. By then, many MMA fighters had figured out BJJ to a certain extent, while some even had black belts within a few years of Gracie submitting people for fun, which is why it became harder for Royce and the other Gracies to continue their dominant run in MMA. Ultimately, Gracie suffered his first career loss at the hands of Japanese MMA legend Kazushi Sakuraba, otherwise known as the Gracie Hunter, for securing wins against 4 members of the Gracie family, namely Royce, Renzo, Ryan, and Royler. Despite the fact that Royce wasn't as successful in the second half of his career as in the first half, he's still the most influential in terms of popularizing the sport. Today, there isn't an MMA fighter who doesn't have some level of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training. The martial arts style is a popular ground fighting base in almost every MMA school, and that's thanks to Royce Gracie. Apart from Royce, Royce Gracie also helped revolutionize and popularize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. While Royce did so in mixed martial arts, Royce made his family proud in the world of submission grappling, winning 10 International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation titles as a black belt, and 4 championship titles in the colored belt divisions. Hajr's ability to commit to submissions and put his opponents out of their misery in the blink of an eye was why he was a class apart. He is widely regarded as one of the greatest submission grapplers of all time, if not the best, and holds a place among the most influential members of his family. With that, we have come to the end of our video on the legacy of the Gracie family and its most influential members, including Helio, Royce, and Royce Gracie. Who do you think is the most influential Gracie? Give us your thoughts in the comments section below. If you liked our video, please show us some love by subscribing and turning on your notifications so we keep bringing you stories like the one you just watched. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.